There we go. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shalom.
I am a little bit hoarse. It is my allergies that are kicking up. So just to let everyone know, I apologize. I can hear that I'm hoarse, but it will only be as long as there's, pollen in the air. So I wanted us to take a look at some of what's going on in the Parsha, and really with the question of, this was so long ago. These people were so long ago. The world was different. The ancient world was different. The biblical world was different. We read it, and it's about Avram and God and this monumental vision that's going to change the world. But now we're living in a world that's been changed. We're living in a world that knows this happened, and the whole world has changed now for millennia. And so we would look at it and say, and it speaks to me in a very foreign way. And when we look at the details of it, and I would really look around the room and say, you wake up one morning and your partner wakes up and says to you, God talked to me. God said we're packing everything up. I'm quitting my job. By the way, so are you. Kids out of school, done. We're leaving now because God said we got to go. And if I were to turn to someone and say, let alone you're not going, there's no question you're not going, but are you seriously concerned that your partner just woke up and said, A, God spoke to me, and B, and now our life changes? So we look at it, no matter where we sit in history, that's got to be a strange one. That's got to be something where anyone in human history would turn to their partner and say, again? What is happening again? God spoke to you? So we look at it and we say, we really have to pierce this a little bit and understand what's going on, or it can't speak to us. It remains too foreign. We know that as we are wired, this is how we learn things. We know that we don't leave things we know. We don't leave them very easily. It doesn't matter if they're good for us or not good for us. We don't leave them very easily. And hence people get caught in places, relationships, and interactions that are detrimental for us. But from the outside, you say, well, then why don't you just leave it? But from the inside, we know it's the leaving that's difficult. It's not going to some place I don't know. It's leaving what I do know. That's what's difficult. And when we look at Lech Lecha and God says, leave everything behind, and if our partner woke up to us and said, ooh, an exciting journey, an adventure, we're going to take it together, I'm on board until I hear and you have to leave everything behind. Now I'm not on board anymore. Now it's that question of leaving things because we're not wired that way. Everyone in education knows we are wired to move from the known to the unknown. We know that. That, by the way, is why we always review last week's lesson before we teach this week's lesson. It's one of the primary things in education. Every teacher will do it. Every professor will do it. Everybody will do it. You move people from the known to the unknown. So first I have to get to the known, and I have to remind, and I have to make sure you know it before I can bring you somewhere new. Hence, I'm going to review. I'm going to review what I know we've already covered, and then I'm going to test you. When I finish a unit, I'm going to test the unit before I move on to the next unit. And part of it is the practical grading. I need to know how everybody's testing on something, and by the way, tests never use one way, never work one way, because it's equally testing me, the educator, did I teach it effectively? So it's always working both ways. That's on a practical level. But on a theoretical level, I have to sit there and say, did I create known? Do they know what I talked about last unit? Can I now move to the unknown? I have to assess that. I have to know that. Or moving to the unknown will fail. It's not that they'll be afraid to go. They won't go. It simply will fail. So we know we are wired that way, and we have to move that way. We don't acquire knowledge. We build knowledge. That's how things work. That's how we accumulate experience, is we build on things that we already know. If we don't create those links, we end up confused because we don't know where to anchor the new knowledge. What am I supposed to do with that? I don't know where to anchor that. And we see it everywhere in our lives, that we need to build on known in order to attain unknown. So, what does Avram already know? That God can now say to him, leave it all behind, off you go, great adventure, no worries. And then the question of why does he go? What does he already know that this is now actually speaking to him so powerfully? And for that, we back up a little bit and we look at Avram's father, because the Torah told us about his father, Terah. It said that Terah begins a family journey. He's already started it. He's already taken his family and left where they come from. And they actually are part of the Chaldeans. We know that. We know they're part of that nation. Culturally, we know they're part of that geography. So Terah has already taken the family and started the move. Physically, he's moved them from one place to the other. Then he dies, and the family stagnates. And God now comes and speaks to Avram and says, okay, now you need to leave the relationships behind, because that's what's blocking you. That's why you can't keep going. So although your father physically left, you actually didn't spiritually, psychologically, or mentally leave. So you got to leave the relationships now. And watch the language of what God says. First, you have to get up and go, me'artzecha, from your land. There's the known, because his father already did that. They are out of the land. They're gone. So we're starting with the known. Then God continues and says, mi moladitcha, from your birthplace. Birthplace is birth language. We don't remember birthplace, but it's culture. Our birthplace is our culture. And it doesn't matter how many times we will immigrate. Our birth language is the language. It's the language we'll dream in. It's the culture that will always feel right. That's not physical. We're moving away from the physical now. And then God goes one step further and says, Beit Avicha, your ancestral home, clearly not physical. Now the circle just got much smaller and tighter, because God is saying all those family relationships, all those intimate relationships, no, leave them behind. You need to move, known to unknown. And we watch the progression of what God is telling Avram and Sarah and saying, you have to journey this way. It is fine, because I'm starting with the known, and that is creating the comfort level to take the journey. But then the question of why leave all those relationships behind, and now we realize that sometimes it's the known things in our lives that hold us back. Avram and Sarah had to leave those relationships behind. They could not grow where they were. It was too constraining. It was too confining. So they needed to disconnect. The fact that we know something doesn't mean it's good for us and that's where we need to sit. It simply means that's what we need to acknowledge so that we will know how we move from one to the other. Every relationship, whether it's good or not, every known, whether it's good or not, it all contributes pieces to who we are. It all contributes to the world we do know. And so we want to be able to acknowledge that, because that is what will secure us as we move forward. In the Parsha, God tells Avram, don't be afraid, God says, because I will protect you and your reward will be great. If God said that to me, I wouldn't worry. If God said, don't worry about it, I got your back. Oh, and by the way, good things are waiting there. It's wonderful. Here's Avram's response. Avram turns to God after that incredible statement and says, really? How do I know that? Prove it. And now he's taking it somewhere else, because he's turning to God and he says, those are pretty words. That's lovely. But you are asking me to leave everything back there. So how do I know? Can you prove to me that something awaits for me in the unknown that I know? God's answer is really interesting, because God says, go outside and look up. Look up at the stars. And then God says what we all recognize, your descendants will be innumerable like the stars in the heaven. It's beautiful, but it didn't answer Avram's question. Avram said, prove it. And that's only because we don't understand Avram's known. It does answer his question. Avram is a Chaldean, and the Chaldeans in the ancient world mapped the stars. It's what they did. So when Avram turns to God and says, prove it, how do I know? God immediately says, here's how I'll prove it to you. Go outside and look up. Look at the known. Look at what you know. You know those stars. You know what they're telling you. You know which direction you're traveling. You can ground yourself. You can navigate. You are not standing there in unknown territory anywhere, because you can always look up. God grounds Avram in the known and then moves him to the unknown and says, what you're looking at are your children. So you thought you were only seeing the stars navigating, you are seeing your future. And now he has successfully moved from the known to the unknown. And then God says to him, now go get some animals, cut them in half, lay them open, dead animals, carcasses open, each half facing the other. And now we're sitting there going, okay, I lost you again. What are we doing now with the animals? What's going on? And when you realize it's a bloodbath, these are large animals. These aren't small animals. And they're being slaughtered, cut in half, laying like that. And then God says, and now we proceed. And it is to put Avram to sleep, and Avram in a vision sees a torch and an oven are passing between the pieces. And this is why it's called the covenant between the pieces. They're passing between the pieces of these dead animals. And somehow Avram awakens and says, fine, you've answered my question. Now you've proved it. Now I know. And we're reading it saying, you haven't answered mine. I don't know. What are you doing? Except you have. Because we can track in an unbroken line what they've done to what we do today. What they've done is they've created a contract. And in the ancient world, you take an animal when you're contracting, when you covenant with someone. You take an animal bought by the two of you. You slaughter, you cut the animal in half. Each of you gets half the animal. That's your covenant. That's physically what you've done. That now means we're in this equally together. And we used to do that with contracts. The very first time that we would write any contract, and remember a time in the world when writing something, etching something, inscribing something, we didn't have the resources we had. We don't duplicate things. So people would have a contract, and then by the time we had paper, we'd rip it in half. And each party gets half the contract. And if it ever shows up in court, you bring your half, and the court will match up the two halves to say, yes, now I have an unforged document because no two pieces of paper will ever tear the same way. So if you're walking into court with your half and they're walking into court with theirs and we match it up, we have proven this was once an agreed document. And I have been told by lawyers the language of that continues into contracts today. So it is an unbroken line. And if anyone thinks of the tradition with a bride and a groom, when the two families are figuring out the t'na'im, the conditions, who's going to support them this way, who's going to give them a house, who's going to give them this, who's going to give them that. It's all agreed. And then some traditions today say, now go break a plate. Why are you breaking a plate? And it is again back to the day when we would take those conditions, we would etch them on clay, and we would break it. And one family would take half of it, and one family would take half of it. This is what God and Avram are doing. It is known to us. It's only happening in a form that doesn't speak to us anymore, but we still do it. So when Avram turned to God and said, prove it, God said, okay, let's get legal. We'll make a contract. We'll put those things next to each other, each of us half. And then in a vision, we've got the torch in the oven going through in the middle, in blood, signing in blood. Their footprints, the images, however we want to talk about it, it's mutual. And both of them are moving through. We've now moved from the known to the unknown, and we've innovated. We've innovated. How do we contract with God? Otherwise, how do you do that? Let alone how do I follow an invisible God? How do I actually enter a contract? That's what Avram was asking about. And that's what we're seeing happening. So when we look at it and we say that if I don't ground myself in these things, things get confusing. I can disorient myself. Things will backfire when I take new journeys and new experiences to places if I haven't moved myself from the known to the unknown. It's not only frightening, it can actually be detrimental. So we sit back and we say, I'm going to look at the Parsha because the Parsha is saying, do and function as we were created. We were created this way. This is what grounds us. We are always to look at our cultures, our relationships, and we're then always to say to ourselves, is it still something I know? Is it still something familiar to me? Am I still grounded? Does it still feel right? Or should I modify it or leave it behind, as Avram was told to do? From there, we find the courage to go somewhere new, to start something unfamiliar. where I ask myself, what part of this thing can I count on, and what part of it should I actually ground in a covenant? Do I actually need some formality of commitment to speak to me so it won't be fleeting? It's a worldview that we're being introduced to in this section of the Torah. It's our jobs, it's our politics, and it's our relationship with God as well. God is the one who is teaching us, go look at the stars. And in them, you will see a future. Now ground it in something you already know. Terach, Avram's father, read the stars, and he started the family on a journey. And they physically left everything behind, and then he died. And God reached out and said, but you have to continue this. And it is one of the many places where the Torah tells us the journey of a life takes longer than a lifetime. Shabbat shalom.